Hello and welcome back to The Conclusion of the Matter. I'm Lynn Ferguson. Joined with me as always is Robbie Santiago and Ryan Weaver. We're glad that you all have joined us again. Solomon wrote in Ecclesiastes 12, verses 13 and 14, "Let us hear the conclusion of the matter. Fear God and keep his commandments, for this is man's all. For God will bring every work into judgment with every secret thing, whether it be good or evil." As we always do with every topic or passage that we look at, just try to study it to the best of our ability to discern what God would have us to do or to think or believe about any given subject. And we will always do that with every episode and with every topic here on this podcast. If you ever have any questions or suggestions on things that you would like for us to cover, feel free to email us at theconclusionofthematter@yahoo.com. Call us, text us, stop us in person if you see us. However you want to get in touch with us. It doesn't matter to us. But I will kick it over to Ryan, I guess.
Thanks, Ren. Today we're gonna. Is this a requested topic? I forgot to ask that, or is this just
I
one
don't think so.
Okay. Today we're gonna look at something that perhaps is difficult to pinpoint.
Yep.
I would say. And I use that word perhaps because we use it a lot. Use it a lot in this situation. And today's episode, if you haven't read the title already, is God's Providence. So providence is different than miraculous in the fact that providence relies on the laws of nature, the way things have been kind of going in motion since the miraculous has been done away with. Ordinary things that we would just say maybe were coincidence or it could have been God's providence. And going back to the perhaps, I think we get that from the book of Esther. The book of Esther was where Esther was made queen.
It's 4:14. I've
4:14.
got it. You want me to read it?
Yeah, go ahead. And this is her uncle Mordecai saying these words to Esther at this point. But
"For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this."
okay, so it doesn't use the word perhaps, but
It's the idea.
same concept is perhaps you were put in this position for this reason.
Yeah.
And I think that's why I say it's hard to pinpoint because we don't really know. I think Ren feels like his relationship with Chloe has some of God's providence. Some people would say my relationship with Amy, by the way, I got married on break.
That's why we're so late getting started, actually.
But anyway,
there's no other reasons.
Natural things happen. Like I sent a password to her accidentally when I was sending an instant message because we were chatting about one meeting and I was on another Zoom, and on that Zoom, I was supposed to go log on to a screen. I thought I was on that screen. I typed in my password, which happened to be a Bible verse reference. And I was like, "Oh, sorry, ignore that." And she goes, "Is that a Bible reference?" And then she's like, "Well, wait a minute. You sandbagging Jesus on me?" I'm like, "Well, I'm not sandbagging. What do you want to know? We'll talk." So that led to a lot of discussion about the religious world. And then, but anyway, and it's like, who knows? I mean, that could have been. But I know you've said the same thing about how you and Chloe met. I think you are on the side of you feel that it was more than not. But
at the same time,
you don't
can't
know.
ever say for certain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, Robbie, do you have anything that's been providential in your life that perhaps?
Well, so even Allison and I's meeting, because and many of our listeners may already know this, but if you don't,
But Robbie's married.
Yeah, I'm married. I got married, but it wasn't.
It wasn't on this past break.
So it's been a little over 5 years. So anyway, we've I guess known who each other were for probably like 10 or 15 years. We met at a birthday party, but Allison's older sister kind of grew up at this congregation. She's got several family members that still attend here. But they moved out to North Carolina, which is where I grew up. And in that process, I met, their family. And then nothing happened with that for like 10 or so years. But then Allison and I met at one of those birthday parties for one of their kids. And then while I was in college, or after I was in college, because I was living in Clarksville then, I happened to be visiting my parents the same weekend that my now in-laws were visiting Jake and Carrie and the kids out there. And so we got to talking after services, not about like, them setting us up or anything, just talking like, we do after church and stuff sometimes. So they go back home, and then long story short, Allison and I kind of get connected on, later Facebook, but first we started messaging. I don't even know if this website's still around, but there's like a Church of Christ singles website that we started messaging back and forth. And then we met up like halfway between Clarksville, where I lived, and St. Louis, where, we all live now. But halfway was in I guess it's a small town, but Carbondale, Marion kind of area in Illinois. And then later, a few weeks later, came up to St. Louis for the weekend and caught a Cardinals game and did a bunch of other fun things. And then we got married. But
After
the
the
fact
Cardinal
that,
game?
so the fact that maybe it's Providence, maybe it's not.
Yeah,
like
I
Brent
mean,
said, like just that we happen.
The
I
fact
happened
that
to be visiting the same
fact
week.
that Jake and Carrie moved to North Carolina, I mean, we'll never know. But
Yeah.
I think that's I think we did an episode on this similar to this. It was one where my niece Peyton had sent me
that video?
the video class
Yeah.
where they were saying that God causes everything to happen for
Yeah.
a reason, and trying to tie
Yeah.
providence to
Yeah.
everything in their life. And I think we just don't see that. I mean, one of the examples was God made the printer run out of ink, so
Yeah.
I'd go to Walmart so I can convert this person.
Yeah.
I-
Well,
I think he
is
allows
it-
things to happen, but I don't think he causes them per se.
Well, in that, I'm sure I brought this up in that episode too. I think it's in Ecclesiastes 9,
Yeah.
verse 11, I want to say.
The swift
That, time and chance happen to them all.
Oh, yeah.
Well,
I'm
it's the same verse. Same
okay,
verse,
where
yeah.
it says not the fast. The
The
fast
run-
doesn't
the race
always
doesn't always
yeah.
go to the swift or the battle to the strong or however he says it, but time and chance happen
Yeah,
to them
that's
all.
the end of it. Okay.
And it's that idea of, sometimes things just happen and there's not really a specific reason for it. God's not orchestrating it. It just happens. But yeah, that providence, you can never really know. While you were talking about that, I was even thinking about us in this podcast, because you married Allison, you moved up here. And then because I married Chloe and Chloe's family is from West Plains, that was one of the driving forces for us to look for a new congregation to work with, which is how we ended up being here and all three of us meeting to start doing this. And so is that God's providence?
You would have been on your own.
That'd have been boring.
And then what was it, that youth event with Caleb Rutherford and Jordan Pugh, and they came up and they were talking about their podcast, and then that's when
It's
you
probably the
approached
arts
me, and it was
conference.
I mean, I don't know if any of that's the providence of God, and that's what
It's hard to
talking about
say,
here, but-
and that's where I think we're all cautious in saying that. I mean, it feels like it could be, but we don't know. It's just that the natural events that took place, I made a decision that impacted, and could have been chance. Who knows? I think that's the difficult aspect of it. But
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Well, in either way, regardless of whether or not God was directly intervening in some way with my relationship with Chloe, or you and Allison, or you and Amy, or our relationship, friendships with one another to do this, regardless, he's still able to use us no matter what situation we may find ourselves in, whether it was guided by God's providence or if it was just circumstance. Wherever we are, whatever we're doing, he's still going to be able to use us. So regardless, my point is we need to give him the glory and the honor for everything.
Right. I guess we could just go ahead and wrap up the episode now. That's pretty much the gist of it, though. It's really difficult for us to say, using mine and Allison's story, that we can definitively say that it was God's providence. Could it have been, or is it likely that it was?
Yeah.
Maybe yes, but we'll never know. I mean, and Allison and I were even talking about this in the car while we were in North Carolina, that you could look at this a whole lot of different way, whether it applies to, jobs. When I first moved up here, I pretty much didn't have a job, but I had a random conversation with my now boss. They didn't have any openings, but then It just so happened that a part-time position was available, so I took that, started working there part-time, and then I've been there full-time now for I think this is my 5th full-time year, something like that.
Wow.
So just things like that, and Allison and her career where she works, and I'm sure that there's several others that feel that way about their career too.
And something you said there made me go back to what Warren was talking about, giving God the glory, because God could have very well had a hand in that. But even if he didn't, you're still thankful that job opened up, right? And you still thank him, whether he had anything to directly do with it or not. He still blessed us, and blessed you in that situation.
Right. And I even, something Ren brought up, I think is a good example of providence. And we brought up Esther a few minutes ago. I mean, there's so many ones that we could bring up that they were placed in a certain position. And in the Old Testament, generally speaking, that was God's providence because he's, here, go here kind of thing, or putting them in those positions. But Joseph's one that automatically comes to my mind. And I will say that we've mentioned this on one of our Out of Context podcasts. The verse that a lot of people will turn to is Jeremiah 29:11.
Yeah.
And so, the point that's making is, yes, God can direct those paths, but I think Genesis chapter 50 and verse 20 kind of gives a clear example of that that's not out of context. But it's talking about Joseph, and when Joseph was sold into slavery for his brothers, and then, numerous points in his life put in difficult situation, God used him to bring about good. Verse 20 says, "But as for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring it about as it is to this day, to save many people alive." And he's talking to his brother, man, like, look, you guys kind of put me in a little bit of a bind here, to put it mildly. But then Joseph didn't just sit there and pout about it or complain. He used it for good, and he was able to help not only his family in that, but also numerous other people that many of which we may not even know. We could point to Esther. I even had on here Moses, several points in Moses' life we could point to.
Well, being put in the river, and then Pharaoh's daughter happening to find him.
Yeah.
I mean, there's nothing in that's miraculous. That was all just circumstances, but God used it.
And even Nehemiah being the cup holder. Ruth's another good example, that, is pure circumstance that she just happened to stay with Naomi, go back, and then, find a husband that later, their son's going to be in the blood lineage of Jesus. And so, there's no way that she could have planned that out. But just, impacting future generations in that way. So even New Testament, Paul comes to mind. He's an easy one, but think of the life that he lived before. And then I would say that we could probably go out on a limb and say that one was God's providence, being the fact that Jesus blinded him on the road to Damascus. So I could probably go out on a limb and say that was God's will that it worked out that way. But eventually he writes, the majority of the New Testament converts who knows how many people when it's all said and done. And it's not about, the statistics or anything.
That doesn't follow the natural laws either. I mean, I'm not going to walk down the road and some miraculous light blind me and that was, to your point, that was direct intervention there. So
I also think about examples like Pilate. I think of him because in John 19 and verse 11, when he's questioning Jesus and Jesus doesn't give him an answer, and Pilate says, "Don't you know that I have the authority to release you?" And Jesus says, "You wouldn't have any authority except it was given to you from above." Pilate, I think, was providentially put in that scenario because God knew how he was going to react and what he was going to do, and it was going to accomplish his ultimate will. I also think I used this one this morning in my sermon, which when this is released, it will be 3 weeks ago. But the example of Isaac and Rebekah in Genesis 24, because there the servant is sent to go back to Abraham's homeland to find a wife for Isaac. and he says that prayer, and he says, let the one who comes and I ask for her to draw water, she'll say, not only for you, but for your animals and whoever else was with them. And that as he was saying that, as he was praying that, Rebecca came to the well, and she ended up being the one to marry Isaac. And so there again, not anything necessarily miraculous taking place in that context. It's just God working through natural circumstances to bring those things about.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing I think that people think about providence is prosperity. And I don't think that's necessarily where providence ends up a lot of times. Because I think some people think that people are prosperous because they're rewarded by God. And, Jesus said that God caused the rain to fall on the just and the unjust. The blessings that we get in this life, some people aren't just, and they're blessed beyond measure. It's not that's not providence. That is God's blessings, right? And I think that to keep in mind here is that providence doesn't prevent bad things from happening to people.
Yeah.
And I think that's where the episode we might have did on why do bad things happen or something along those lines. Our point is we can read more in the New Testament about bad things are going to happen to a Christian than having the comfort of life. And I think that's something with providence we need to be careful of, is that it's not just, it doesn't mean prosperity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think the flip side of that is also true, where it doesn't, cause bad things to happen either. And that
it's not karma. I think in season 6, you were gonna have an episode on karma or something like that. Do you remember him saying that in one of the final episodes? Is like, and then he quickly said, "Not that I believe in karma." But I get what you're saying. Yeah, I don't think that providence is working that way either.
Right. Yeah. Well, you think of the lame man. That's kind of Jesus kind of grilled the Pharisees for that. That they thought that.
Yeah.
When which one sinned? Was it him and was it his parents? They thought it was a result of the sin of somebody, but it really wasn't that the case at all. Which is what Jesus kind of goes on to explain. So it's not going to give you a lot of money, and it's also not going to cause harm in that way. So I think both things are true.
Yeah.
It also does not remove free will. I think that's something that God didn't make me make a choice, right. and I don't know if sometimes we'll show me some people are like, show me which way you want me to go.
Yeah,
and I think we can use His Word to kind of make an intelligent decision. If you got two paths and both of them are okay, then I don't know that there's a wrong decision from a salvation standpoint.
Yeah.
If you got two paths and one is definitely going to cause problems with your salvation, then I think there's a right path, and you better use God's Word to determine that. Yeah. But we have the ability to choose stuff, right?
Yeah.
And it's like, could my free will be something that God knows I'm going to do something?
Yeah.
That's the other thing we got to remember is that God knows what's happening before it's even happening, and that it's going to happen before. Who knows? I mean, if the world's still around in 10 years, He knows what I'm going to be, what I'm going to say to somebody if I'm still around.
Yeah.
But He doesn't cause me to do that. Now, He may influence what I say or do based upon how where this is at in my life. But He's not. That's not providence either.
Well, yeah, because I think that goes back to providence is working through natural circumstances, which would include our free will. And I think the example of all of these examples that we pointed at, Esther and Joseph are good examples of that. All of that happened with Joseph was because his brothers sold him as slaves. God didn't make them do that, but He was able to work through their free will to bring about the salvation or preservation of the family of Israel and or Jacob. And just like with Esther, He didn't necessarily make Mordecai or Haman or Esther do the things that they did, but through their free will, which, as you pointed out, was, especially for Esther and Mordecai, it was informed by Scripture. He was able to use them in that scenario. So, like you said, in the situation where there are two paths to take, and one of them, they're not immoral decisions. Maybe they're completely neutral, or maybe they're both just as good. Whatever one we choose, God's going to be able to use that for whatever He intends to use it for, if anything.
Right.
And well, that goes back to the whole thing.
Perhaps
it's like we can't pinpoint it, and I think that's the thing that drives people crazy about this. I would like to know.
For certain.
Yeah,
we don't like maybes.
Yeah.
So a couple of things that I had thought about. I read an article sometime this weekend that was through Apologetics Press, and it's kind of talking about, free will in a sense, but kind of atheists claim that if God is all loving, that He's all powerful, but at the same time, evil exists as God calls that evil. And then kind of like what you guys were talking about is the same conclusion that the magazine reached, that, at the end of the day, we all have free will to either choose to follow God or to not, but it's not because God is, providentially or miraculously pushing us to do it a certain way, or that He's condemning us. It's our own free will.
Yeah.
But in all of those Old Testament examples, I also keep in mind that not only was God, possibly working through, well, not possibly, but that Esther and some of these other ones that God was with them, but also God through just natural processes also allowed different kingdoms and kings to come that are going to bring about His will.
Yeah.
And I automatically think of Cyrus and many of your Persian leaders. I brought up Nehemiah. Nehemiah wasn't the king; he was the cupbearer. But about that same time that Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther are written, that's going to be when the Jews are coming out of captivity, and they're going to be allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild the temple and rebuild the walls. But maybe if somebody else is king, or if there's another group that's in power, the Assyrians, for example, then that may have gone pretty differently. So, so there's a lot of instances in the Bible, and it's hard to compare biblical examples to today. Was God behind Allison and I meeting, or X, Y, or Z event? I had a guy that I went to church with. He taught our Bible class. I don't remember what year, but I was probably in high school or so. And he told the story of how he had been living a not a very godly life, and that he would go to church and stuff, but it really hadn't affected his character and things like that, and he had a lot of bad influences in his life. But there was something that happened, it being a car accident, and that he was able to get up and get out of that car and still that he didn't die from that, and that the car wreck was right in front of a Church of Christ, and then that he saw that as kind of a sign that maybe I should start acting right. So situations like that, we obviously, again, like we've been saying, can't say definitively, but
we would like to think
maybe that was the case, and maybe that that brought about good in the same way that Joseph was put in a bad situation. Maybe given that it was a car accident, I don't remember how severe it was, but I think it sounded pretty serious from what I remember it being, probably 15, 20 years ago. But it's hard to compare what happened to Paul, what happened to Esther, and a lot of these people in the Bible, because it was during the age where God was actively doing miracles, and at times, Gideon, for example, working outside of the laws of nature and things. So a little different today.
The other thing I was wanting to bring up is the fact that providence is promised to specifically to His people. Like, in the general sense, it's given to all men, like you brought up in Matthew 5. But it's specifically promised to those who are His people in the realm of what He goes on to in Matthew 6, talks about physical necessities. We see that God, well, like your job, what you talked about whenever you had moved up here but didn't have a job, and then you happen to have that conversation with your now boss.
Mm-hmm.
God has promised to take care of us and meet those physical necessities, which is why we still can't say for certain that that's the case. But it's easier for me to feel more certain
Yeah.
that those things are the case because he's made that promise to us that he's going to provide for us. Now, if that had fallen through, he would have done it some other way, but ultimately it would have been accomplished. He also promises providence, I have here, in trials, because he's tells us, like in Matthew chapter 10, when Christ is sending out the 12, and he's talking about how they're going to suffer persecution and hardships and all of this. And he says, aren't 2 sparrows sold for a penny, and not one of them falls without your Father knowing? I can't remember exactly how he says it. He says, aren't you worth a lot more than 2 sparrows to God? He sees, he knows he's going to help you through. Providentially, he'll help you through in some way. But then he also helps us providentially just in our spiritual lives. Like we were kind of talking about in the last episode, we want to do what's right. We want to follow him. And if we're studying and if we're learning from God's word, he will help us do that. Like I think I've been thinking more frequently about Philippians chapter 2, verses 12 and 13, because at the end of verse 12, we're told to work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. But in verse 13, we're told, for it is God who is at work in you, both to will and to work for his good pleasure. And so he is working along with us providentially and through his word to help us make our way through this life and to heaven. And so I was just wanting to bring that up before we close here in a few minutes, that providence is promised to his people.
Yeah, I think that Romans 8:28 is a verse that, you think about that. All things, doesn't say that all things are going to be good. It says all things will work toward the good for those that love the Lord, called according to his purpose, which is what you're referring to there, is that promise is there that God will make it work toward the end result's going to be the good. Now, I don't know that necessarily means in this life always, but definitely in the afterlife for sure. But that's where we see this article here. It's also from Apologetics Press, and I forgot who wrote it. Kyle Butt did. But there's a statement in here, if I can get back to it. It goes back to God knowing.
Romans 8:28. I also had the Genesis 50 verse 20 kind of with that same idea. I think those two are good examples of each other.
He says, in one sense, all life comes from God, and the fact that anyone can take a breath is a providential blessing. In another sense, God has promised that all events in the life of those who love him will be orchestrated in a way that they will work together for the ultimate good, which is what we see in that verse. The other thing I wanted to, God does not promise that everything that happens to those who love him will be good. Instead, he promises that they will work together so that the end result is good.
Yeah.
So. Now, what was the Genesis? Is that the Joseph?
Yeah.
Joseph.
You meant it
Genesis.
for evil, but God meant it for good.
Right. I think Romans 8:28 is making that same point, but you can kind of see a concrete example of that by bringing in Genesis 50 verse 20.
Yep.
And I also kind of had some different angles on providence. A lot of these, if not most of these, we've kind of touched on already. But God just general provision. Ren, you talked about or referenced Matthew chapter 6. I think is a good example of that. The fact that He's going to give guidance to us, whether that be through studying His Word. Automatically, I think of Proverbs chapter 3, verses 5 and 6, verses like that. Talk about that God's going to, that it's going to work out in a good way in the end if we're doing what we should be doing. Romans 8:28, Genesis 50 verse 20. Also, just using nations in certain situations, that His plan is ultimately going to providentially work out. Whether we're talking about in context of the new covenant being established, or His plan for in any context, individually or collectively. So there's several different aspects of God's providence, and you could go down rabbit holes for each of these, but it's not just one individual thing that God's providential over.
Yep.
So.
Well, anything else?
I don't have anything.
I don't think I have anything either.
Okay. So again, we thank you for joining us. Don't forget to like, subscribe, share,
Yes. Comment.
We're on all the different podcast. I shouldn't say all, but a majority of the podcast
The
platforms.
major ones at least. Yeah.
YouTube as well. But anyway, did we talk about emailing at the beginning? I don't remember.
I
Okay.
did.
So go back and listen to that. But perhaps providentially God has brought us all together today.
Yeah.
But we don't know for sure. We're just here by our own decisions, but God could have orchestrated the outcome. But anyway, that was another thing he said, Kyle. Then is similar, God knows. This goes back to us having to realize God knows the decision that's being made down the road. Similarly, he knows that what every person will do, using that knowledge, he can arrange the events to accomplish his ends through natural circumstances.
Yeah.
Again, separating miraculous from providential.
Yeah.
So anyway, I think we have reached the conclusion of the matter.